The sound beneath the steel. The hangar smelled like old oil, rust, and the particular kind of abandonment that settles into places when human beings stop paying attention to them. It was the smell of neglect made physical, thick and metallic at the back of the throat, layered with dust that had been undisturbed long enough to develop its own texture, its own weight. The corrugated steel walls groaned occasionally when the wind came down off the Varath Mountains and pushed against them, a low structural complaint, like the building itself was expressing an opinion about being left out here on the eastern edge of forward operating base Kestrel without any real purpose anymore. The afternoon light came through in long, diagonal shafts where the roof panels had warped apart over the years, cutting through the dusty air in pale gold columns that illuminated nothing particularly useful. Sergeant Marcus Hale had been in better places. He had also objectively been in significantly worse ones, but those had at least offered the decency of being dangerous enough to keep his mind occupied. This was the particular misery of the completely tedious inventory work, decommissioned equipment, a clipboard and actual physical clipboard because the base's digital requisition system had been down for 4 days and showed no signs of philosophical recovery, and a pen that was already running out of ink on its third page. He moved through the rows of dead machinery with the resigned efficiency of a man who had learned, over 11 years of military service, that the work that needed doing most was almost never the work that anyone wanted to do. Broken haulers, stripped engine blocks the size of small cars, squatting on their pallets like enormous industrial monuments to poor maintenance decisions. Stacked crates of parts that had been obsolete for 6 years, cataloged and forgotten and left here to commune with the dust. A forklift with no forks. 2 fuel tanks that had been drained and decommissioned, and then, for reasons that the paperwork did not adequately explain, never removed from the premises. Marcus noted each item, made his marks, moved on. He was not a man who typically indulged in bitterness. He had, over the course of his career, developed what he privately considered a fairly sophisticated philosophy about the nature of unpleasant assignments, namely, that they existed, that they would continue to exist regardless of anyone's feelings on the subject, and that the most efficient response to them was to complete them without ceremony and get back to something that mattered. It was not a glamorous philosophy. It had, however, served him considerably better than the alternative. Still, he could have done without the inventory work. He had been assigned to it 3 days ago, in what he was fairly certain was his commanding officer's subtle way of expressing displeasure about the questions Marcus had raised at last week's briefing regarding the drone patrol protocols in the northeastern sector. The protocols were, in Marcus's professional assessment, poorly calibrated for the terrain, too fast, too indiscriminate, exactly the kind of automated system that worked perfectly in controlled testing environments, and then in actual mountain conditions became a liability. He had said so, twice, with supporting data the second time. Captain Renner had thanked him for his input, and then, 48 hours later, assigned him to catalog the decommissioned equipment in Hangar 7. The correlation was, Marcus reflected, not subtle. He rounded the end of a row of stripped-down engine blocks and stopped to consult his clipboard, squinting at the handwritten list in the fatting light. His pen scratched against the paper. The building groaned. Wind moved through it in that low, spectral way, threading between the gaps and the rusted seams, carrying grit and the cold, clean smell of the mountains that lay beyond the base's perimeter fence. And then, beneath all of it, beneath the structural complaining of the building and the scratch of his pen and the distant mechanical sounds of the base going about its business, he heard something else. He stopped writing. He stood still for a moment, the way a person does when a sound has registered at the edge of consciousness but hasn't yet assembled itself into anything identifiable. His pen stayed poised above the clipboard. His eyes moved without purpose across the middle distance, the way eyes do when the ears are doing the real work. There it was again. Not mechanical. He cataloged that immediately, the way 11 years of being in places where identifying sounds quickly was a survival skill rather than a courtesy made it automatic. Not the wind, though it shared something of the wind's irregularity. This was softer, wetter, a breathing sound, but a breathing sound that kept hitching, kept catching on something, like a door on a warped frame that required a particular kind of patience to open properly. Small, whatever was making it was small. Marcus set his clipboard on the nearest flat surface, the corner of a crate, and moved toward the sound with the careful, deliberate quiet of someone who had learned that the distance between a contained situation and an uncontained one was often measured in the noise a person made approaching it. He moved past the engine blocks, past a second row of crates, these ones unmarked and stacked unevenly, leaning against each other with the camaraderie of things that had been placed temporarily 15 years ago and never revisited, past a tangle of old cable that someone had coiled against the wall and abandoned. The light here was worse. The gold shafts from the warped roof panels didn't reach this far back, and what remained was a deep, layered shadow with texture and depth. He almost missed it. The canvas tarp was the same gray-brown as everything else back here, the same industrial nothing color that all old military equipment eventually faded to, as though prolonged proximity to the institution leached the distinctiveness out of things. It was piled against the base of the furthest engine block, heaped in the loose, formless way of something that had been dragged there rather than placed, and it was moving. Not dramatically, not the thrashing movement of something trapped or panicking, just the small, rhythmic shuddering of something alive and cold and frightened, trying to make itself smaller than it already was. Marcus crouched to see beneath the engine block's overhanging bulk, and the tarp shifted, and he saw the eyes first. Amber, enormous. The kind of enormous that exists in young things and makes them look like they were assembled from parts that haven't quite negotiated their final proportions, yet the eyes of something in the process of growing into itself. They caught what little light existed in the back of the hangar and held it, luminous and aware. And they fixed on Marcus with an intelligence that was so immediate and so complete that it stopped him with the particular effectiveness that genuine intelligence, encountered unexpectedly, tends to stop people. He took in the rest of it in pieces, the way the mind processes the genuinely unexpected, not all at once, but in a sequence of realizations that arrived and settled and made room for the next one. Scales, deep violet, or what might have been deep violet in better light, though right now they had the quality of something wrong about them, dull in the specific way that living things go dull when something essential is running low. The color of a bruise that is still deciding how dark it intends to be. They were small scales, fine-grained, laid over a body that was compact and hunched in the way of something instinctively trying to minimize the space it occupied. Wings, folded so tightly against the small body that they were barely visible, the membrane pulled thin across the folded architecture of bone beneath. Trembling with each of those hitching breaths. Trembling with the cold that radiated off the concrete floor. Trembling with the particular full-body tremor of an exhausted creature that has been frightened for too long. A tail curled around the whole arrangement with the slightly imprecise commitment of something that hadn't entirely learned what to do with a tail yet. It kept shifting, readjusting, as though the instructions for the appendage were still being worked out. A head that was disproportionately large for the body, the way young creatures' heads always are, as though development had prioritized the brain and left the rest of the body to catch up at its own pace. A jaw that was slightly too big for the face around it. Nostrils that flared when Marcus moved, tasting his presence with an automatic animal precision that was entirely at odds with the lost, frightened look of everything else. It was a dragon, a young one. A very young one by the look of it, and Marcus had, in 11 years on the Verath frontier, seen enough draconic fauna at enough distances to have developed a working understanding of what the various stages of development looked like, even if that understanding had always been theoretical and observed from ranges that the relevant standing orders enthusiastically recommended. This was not a theoretical or distant range. This was perhaps 4 feet. This was close enough that he could see the individual scales at the edge of the creature's jaw, close enough to hear the precise quality of those hitching, catching breaths. He stayed very still. The eyes watched him with that devastating intelligence, and he could see the calculation happening behind them, the rapid, desperate processing of a mind weighing options in conditions that had run very short on good ones. Flight was clearly being considered and just as clearly being set aside. The small body's posture changed fractionally when the thought moved through it, a tension that came and went. Fight was being considered with even less enthusiasm. Too small, too tired, too cold, too aware of its own limits. What remained was the option that frightened creatures resort to when everything else has been weighed and discarded. Trust, or at least the attempt at it. Marcus recognized the moment it happened. The small body settled, not relaxed, not at ease, but committed to a direction. The enormous amber eyes steadied. The trembling didn't stop, but it changed quality, became the trembling of a cold creature rather than a terrified one. And then, in a voice that was barely more than a rasp, hoarse and effortful and thin with exhaustion, but shaped with such careful deliberateness that Marcus understood immediately that this was not a creature speaking reflexively but one that had prepared this sentence, that had built it out of limited resources and considerable need, and whatever reservoir of courage it had left, the small dragon said, "Mama is dying, will you help me?" The words fell into the dusty silence of the hangar and sat there. Marcus had been in the military for 11 years. He had been in 3 active conflict zones, 2 humanitarian operations, 1 particularly unpleasant peacekeeping assignment that he still occasionally dreamed about in ways that weren't pleasant, and 1 protracted border standoff that had lasted 8 months and resolved itself through diplomacy in a way that everyone involved found deeply anticlimactic. He had been afraid in the real, bone-level way, not the surface adrenaline way, a handful of times. He had held a dying man's hand once because there was nothing else to offer. He had made decisions under fire that he had subsequently had to make peace with by whatever means were available. He was not, by his own reckoning, an easily shaken man. The look in those eyes shook him. Not the words, though the words were extraordinary enough, a dragon child speaking the common tongue with the careful pronunciation of someone who had learned it from listening rather than instruction, forming each syllable with a precision that spoke of how much the sentence mattered to the creature constructing it. But it was the look behind the words that got through whatever composure he had assembled for himself, the specific combination of fear and dignity and desperate sincerity. The look of someone who had made themselves completely vulnerable because they had decided, apparently, that honesty was the only currency they had left. He had seen that look on human faces. It was harder to encounter than most people expected. He exhaled slowly. He let the moment settle into something workable, something he could operate in. And then he did the thing he always did when the situation required steadiness rather than reaction. He moved his body into a posture that communicated what he intended to communicate, because bodies speak a language that fear understands before words do. He lowered himself to one knee, slow and deliberate, bringing himself down to the creature's level. He kept his hands open, visible, resting on his thighs where they could be seen doing nothing. He kept his voice at the register he used with frightened people who needed to hear that the person talking to them was not adding to the problem. "Tell me what's wrong with her," he said. "Start from the beginning, take whatever time you need." The dragon child's name, communicated in a series of careful exchanges over the next 10 minutes, was Siveth. It came out in pieces, not because Siveth was reluctant to share it, but because the telling of the whole situation kept interrupting the introductions, kept shouldering its way forward with the urgency of something that couldn't wait for social formalities to be completed. Marcus learned the name and he learned the situation in the same overlapping, interwoven way. And by the time he had both clearly, the light in the hangar had shifted further toward evening, and his knee was aching against the concrete floor, and the full weight of what he was being told had settled across his shoulders like a physical thing. Siveth's mother was Varathos. The name was delivered with a particular quality that Marcus recognized as the specific reverence children have for their parents when the parents have been, in the child's direct experience, the largest and most important thing in the world. Not a god, not that kind of reverence, which tends to have a quality of distance in it, but something more immediate. The reverence of someone for whom the named person was simply the foundation everything else rested on. Varathos had been wounded 3 days ago, not in battle, not in any of the territorial disputes or clan conflicts that periodically made the northeastern sector difficult, but in flight. A routine flight, Siveth indicated, low over the mountain passes in the pre-dawn dark, the kind of movement that the draconic population of the Varath Range had conducted for longer than the military installation below it had existed. The patrol drones had come from the south. Marcus felt something cold and specific move through him as Siveth described it, the sound of them, the lights, the speed. The way Varathos had banked hard trying to clear the patrol corridor, but the drones had been operating on the new parameters, the faster sweep pattern, the extended range, and one of them had clipped her left wing, the impact of the collision driving a fragment of the drone's housing deep into the muscle cluster at her shoulder joint before she could pull clear. The new parameters, the ones Marcus had raised concerns about at last week's briefing, the ones he had provided supporting data for twice. He stayed with that knowledge for exactly as long as it took him to acknowledge it and set it aside. There was a time for that accounting, and it was not this time. Varathos had made it down. That was the extraordinary part. Marcus knew enough about draconic physiology to understand that the landing alone on a damaged wing with a piece of metal lodged in the shoulder represented a considerable feat of will and skill. She had found the ravine system northeast of the base, the deep-cut geological scar in the mountainside where the rock overhang provided cover from above and the natural wind patterns discouraged casual aerial survey. She had hidden them there. She had kept Siveth close, had kept the young dragon calm, had maintained, through what Marcus could only imagine was a comprehensive act of maternal determination, a semblance of stability over the first 2 days. And then the fever had come. Siveth's description of the fever was the part that was hardest to listen to. Not because it was dramatic, it wasn't in the telling. It was very quiet, and that was precisely what made it hard. The way the young dragon described watching Varathos's color change, the scales losing their copper richness and going ashy and wrong. The way the heat had radiated from the wounded shoulder, visible even from a distance, the tissue around the wound swelling and darkening. The way Varathos's breathing had become the labored, wet sound that Marcus had heard medical personnel describe, in various professional contexts, as a sound that indicated things were moving in the wrong direction. The way she had started sleeping more, the way she had yesterday stopped eating. Siveth had left her sleeping this morning to find food. There was a stream nearby, fish in it, and Siveth was small enough and practiced enough to catch them, and had been returning to the ravine when the wind had shifted and carried the smell of the base across the hillside. Human smells, mechanical smells. And underneath them, the particular complex smell of medicines and treated materials that even a young dragon's sophisticated olfactory sense could identify as something humans used when things were damaged and needed fixing. Scythe had crept to the base's perimeter and watched for a long time, had observed the soldiers moving through the compound, the vehicles, the routines, the patterns, had watched the eastern edge of the installation, where the old hangar sat in its isolated rust, and had seen Marcus move in and out of it twice with his clipboard methodical and alone, and apparently in no particular hurry. Had crept inside, had hidden, had waited. She told me not to trust humans, Scythe said near the end of this accounting. The amber eyes held Marcus's steadily. There was no accusation in the statement, no bitterness. It was delivered as pure factual context, the kind of information a careful intelligence provides because full information is more useful than partial. She has reasons for this. There have been events before I was born, things that she remembers. Marcus nodded. That's reasonable of her, he said. Given the current state of things, that's an entirely reasonable position. Scythe's expression shifted in some way that Marcus couldn't fully read. Something complicated moved through it, some adjustment to a calculation that had been running in the background. But she also told me, the young dragon continued in the same careful, measured voice, that dying is worse than being wrong. The silence after that had a weight to it. Marcus sat with it for a moment. He looked at the small violet creature wrapped in its torn canvas tarp, shivering with cold and exhaustion and the particular kind of spentness that comes from having been afraid for a long time and having had to be braver than available resources should really allow. He looked at the enormous amber eyes that had not once looked away from his face, that had watched him with a steady, unsparing attention throughout this entire conversation, cataloging his reactions, measuring him against whatever criteria a frightened young dragon applied to the question of whether a human being was worth the risk of trusting. "Smart mama," he said. His voice came out quiet and level, and he meant it entirely. He stood up, his knee protested, he ignored it. He looked at the hangar door, where the evening light was coming in thin and pale, and the sounds of the base's routine were filtering through distant engines, voices, the mechanical business of a military installation in the ordinary part of its day. He ran the arithmetic that the situation required, protocol, standing orders, the dozen different ways this could unfold badly. The reporting structures and the chain of command and the intelligence unit that had very particular opinions about unsanctioned contact with draconic fauna in the Verath region. He ran all of it against the weight of what Scythe had described in this dusty, abandoned hangar in a voice barely above a rasp. He ran it and he found where it balanced, and he turned back to the small shivering creature under its tarp. "I need to get some things from the medical bay," he said. "There are going to be people moving around in there, and I need to move around in there without anyone asking me questions, which means I need to go alone and look like I have a reason to be there. That means you stay here." He held up a hand to forestall the anxiety he could see beginning to gather behind those amber eyes. "You stay hidden, you stay under that tarp. You stay quiet and you don't move, and you let me handle the part that I know how to handle. Can you do that?" Scythe looked at him for a long moment. That measuring, ancient in the young quality of the gaze moved over him one more time, doing whatever accounting it was doing. Then the small dragon pulled the canvas tarp up around itself with a deliberateness that was almost formal, settling into stillness, the way a creature does when it has made a decision and committed fully to the consequences of it. One nod, slow and solemn. "Good." Marcus picked up his inventory clipboard from the crate where he'd left it and tucked it under his arm. He took a breath. He arranged his face into the expression he wore when he was walking through the base with entirely routine intentions, the expression that had served him well across 11 years and 3 continents. 20 minutes, maybe 25. Don't count it too carefully. Medical bay timing isn't always predictable, but I'll be back. He walked toward the hangar door with the deliberately even stride of a man who absolutely was not currently in the process of making a decision that his commanding officer would later describe, in formal and increasingly emphatic language, as unsanctioned, unauthorized, and representing a fundamental misunderstanding of standing operational orders regarding contact with indigenous draconic fauna in the Verath sector. Behind him, under the canvas tarp, in the long dusty shadows at the back of Hangar 7, something small and violet and shivering allowed itself, very carefully, to hope. Marcus Hale walked out into the late afternoon light of forward operating base Kestrel and headed for the medical bay, already composing, somewhere in the back of his disciplined and thoroughly committed mind, the list of everything he was going to need. He did not look back. He didn't need to. He had said he would return, and he was a man who did not say things he did not mean, and that was simply the end of that particular question. The hangar door swung shut behind him with a hollow, metallic sound that echoed once through the dusty interior and then dissolved into the silence. And the silence settled back over everything. And in the shadows at the back of the building, a small dragon breathed carefully, deliberately, one breath at a time, and waited. The ravine and the fevers. The medical bay at Forward Operating Base Kestrel occupied a long, low building near the center of the compound. Practical, well-lit, and staffed with the particular brand of organized efficiency that Corporal Danny Osai had imposed on it within approximately 72 hours of her arrival 18 months ago, and maintained through a combination of genuine competence and a personality that made Disorder feel personally embarrassed about itself. Marcus had always liked Danny. She was one of those people whose presence in a place made the place function better, not through authority exactly, but through a kind of gravitational professionalism that other people's habits naturally oriented themselves around. She had grown up in Accra, trained in Cape Town, and arrived at Kestrel with a medical kit that she had personally modified and a set of opinions about field triage protocol that she delivered without apology and defended with data. She was also, crucially, the kind of person who asked questions when she intended to get answers and refrained from asking when she had already decided that the answer was not her business. Marcus was counting heavily on the second quality this evening. He came through the medical bay's main entrance at a pace that communicated purpose without urgency, the pace of a man who needed a thing and knew where the thing was, not the pace of a man who was nervous about needing the thing. He nodded to the two soldiers in the waiting area, one with a wrapped wrist, one with the particular 1,000-yard expression of someone waiting out a headache, and moved through the main treatment room toward the back without breaking stride. Danny was at her desk in the small administrative alcove off the main room, writing something in her precise, economical hand. She looked up when he passed. Her eyes tracked him with the automatic assessment of someone whose professional training had made the evaluation of physical states involuntary and continuous. "Hail," she said, not a greeting exactly, more of an acknowledgement of a phenomenon. "Osai," he replied, matching her register. He kept moving. "Don't mind me." "I never do," she said, which was technically true and also, in this instance, possibly the most useful thing anyone had said to him all day. She went back to her writing. The secondary supply cabinet was in the back room, a smaller space that served as overflow storage, equipment maintenance, and when the base's social geography required it, a place for people to have conversations that benefited from walls. Danny restocked this cabinet herself, logged it in her own ledger rather than the base's central inventory system, and had never in 18 months explained why. Marcus had carried boxes to it 4 times and asked no questions on any occasion, operating on the sound principle that systems which work should not be interrogated into dysfunction. Open the cabinet. He worked quickly with the efficient selectivity of someone who had a clear list in his head and was executing against it rather than browsing. Broad-spectrum antibiotics, the injectable kind, higher bioavailability, better for a wound that had been closed and infected for 3 days. Antiseptic solution, 2 bottles, trauma bandaging, the modern kind with the embedded coagulant. Saline, a full liter bag, forceps, the longer ones, the ones designed for depth work. Irrigation syringe. A pair of examination gloves, 2 sizes up from his own because he had, in the back of his mind, a working theory about the scale structure of draconic tissue and how it might complicate a standard approach. He looked at the selection for a moment, added a second set of bandaging, added a topical antibiotic packet, the kind that could be worked into a wound site before closure. He found a piece of paper in his breast pocket, a torn corner of his inventory sheet, and wrote 4 words on it with his dying pen. "I owe you, MH." He weighted it under the edge of a supply box where Danny would find it on her next restock and would understand it in whatever way she chose to understand it. He closed the cabinet, packed everything into his field bag with the practiced compression of someone who had packed field bags under worse conditions than these, and walked back through the medical bay at the same purposeful, unbothered pace. Danny did not look up as he passed. He was outside in 4 minutes, under 7 from entrance to exit. He breathed the cold mountain air and felt the specific, clarifying quality of having committed to a course of action, that clean, narrow feeling where the options have collapsed down to the one you've chosen, and the only thing remaining is the execution. He turned east and headed for the hangar. Siveth was exactly where he had left it. This somehow was the thing that got to him, more than the asking for help had, more than the story, more than the look in those enormous eyes. The simple fact of it. The small violet shape under its canvas tarp in the exact position he'd left it, not having moved, not having bolted in the 23 minutes he'd been gone, holding to the arrangement with a faithfulness that was almost painful given how little basis it had had for trusting that the arrangement would be honored. He came through the hangar door and moved to the back, and the amber eyes opened before he was halfway down the row, sharp, Immediate, alert in the way of something that had not actually slept, but had kept itself very still and very quiet because it had said it would. The tarp shifted. The small head lifted. The expression on Siveth's face, in the moment before composure reassembled itself, was the expression of someone who had prepared themselves for disappointment so thoroughly that the absence of it required a moment of recalibration. Marcus crouched and set the bag down between them. He opened it without preamble, letting the contents be seen. Siveth looked at the supplies with those sharp amber eyes, taking in each item with an attention that suggested it understood, perhaps not the precise clinical purpose of each thing, but the category of purpose, the general direction of intent. "This is going to help her," Marcus said, not a question, a statement made to establish shared ground, "but I need you to take me to her. I need to see the wound before I can know exactly what we're dealing with, and I need her to let me close enough to do something about it." He paused, letting the weight of that land properly. "That second part is the one I don't know how to guarantee." Siveth was quiet for a moment. When it spoke, its voice had recovered some of its steadiness, still hoarse, still thin but less ragged than before. Rested, Marcus thought, or as close to rested as 23 minutes of enforced stillness could achieve. "She will not make it easy," the young dragon said. "She is," a pause, searching for the word, "particular about humans near her when she is hurt." "Particular," Marcus repeated, filing the word away for what it almost certainly represented in practical terms. "Okay. But she is also," Siveth stopped again. The amber eyes moved away from Marcus for the first time, dropping to the floor between them with an expression that was complicated and young and very tired. "She is worse than yesterday. I know what worse looks like. I have been watching her for 3 days and I know what the direction is." The eyes came back up. "She will not refuse help because she is proud. She will refuse it because she does not trust. Those are different things." "They are," Marcus agreed. "I understand the difference." Something in Siveth's posture shifted slightly at that, another of those small recalibrations, the ongoing internal accounting that Marcus had begun to recognize as the young dragon's continuous process of measuring him against the emerging evidence. "Then we should go now," Siveth said. "The light is going. She sleeps badly in the dark, the fever makes it worse." Marcus shouldered the bag, stood, and followed the small dragon out of the hangar into the long amber light of early evening. They moved northeast through the tree line at the base's perimeter, and the way Siveth moved through it was a revelation. Marcus was good in cover. 11 years of fieldwork had made him genuinely competent in the specific skill set of moving through terrain without advertising the movement. But watching Siveth navigate the scrub and scattered pine at the mountain's lower edge was something else entirely. Even this young, even this small, even this exhausted, the creature moved with a flowing, instinctive economy that made Marcus's own careful technique feel effortful by comparison. It found the spaces between things, the sightline gaps, the ground that would carry a footfall without sound, with the automatic ease of something that had inherited 10,000 years of predatory refinement. It moved in short runs between cover, each one considered, each pause used to assess the next move. It looked back at Marcus twice, not to check that he was keeping up, but to read his position relative to the available cover, adjusting its own route to accommodate his larger profile. There was something in that consideration that Marcus noticed and tucked away. The young dragon wasn't just fleeing or leading, it was solving the problem of two different bodies moving through the same terrain, accounting for both, thinking in a plural that went beyond simple self-interest. Evening came down as they moved, the Varath Mountains doing what the Varath Mountains did in the hour before full dark, which was to turn the light gold and then amber and then a deep saturated copper that made everything look simultaneously beautiful and slightly ominous. The base's sounds faded behind them. The mountain sounds grew to fill the space, wind in the pine, the distant water sound of snowmelt running somewhere below the rock, the occasional far-off call of something moving in the upper elevations. 40 minutes of moving brought them to the ravine. Marcus smelled it before he saw it, a heat smell, wrong and organic, the smell of infection that his nose recognized from field hospital proximity, from wound management in conditions where wound management was difficult. It was stronger than he'd expected, carried on the evening air with a directness that told him the infection had progressed considerably in 3 days of untreated progression. His jaw tightened slightly. He followed Siveth down the ravine's edge, moving carefully on the loose rock, and then around a shelf of stone and through a gap in the brush, and the world opened into the hidden space beneath the overhang and he stopped completely. Varathos was immense. Marcus had known intellectually that adult dragons were large. He had seen them at distance, through binoculars, through the magnified perspective of surveillance equipment, had seen their shape against the sky and in the thermal imaging of aerial survey, had developed the kind of abstract size awareness that distance allows. None of that had adequately prepared him for the experience of being close. She was the length of a bus, lying on her side in the narrow width of the ravine floor, And even lying down there was a quality of compressed power in her that changed the spatial dynamics of the space she occupied. Her scales were copper, a deep, burnished, magnificent copper that Marcus could see had once been extraordinary, that the illness had stripped of its luster in the specific way that illness strips things of their best qualities first, leaving the structure while mooting everything that made the structure vivid. They had gone ashy at the edges. The sheen was wrong. Her flank rose and fell with each breath, but the breath was labored and wet and too careful in the way that bodies breathe when breathing has stopped being automatic and started being work. Her wounded shoulder was immediately and horribly obvious. The scales around it had darkened to a deep, angry brown-black, standing slightly proud of the surrounding tissue with the swollen, pressurized look of deep infection. The heat radiating from it was palpable from 10 feet away, a dry, feverish warmth that pressed against the cooler air of the ravine like something trying to escape. The wound site itself, where the shrapnel had driven through the scale layer into the muscle beneath, was a dark, seeping thing that Marcus looked at and felt his medical instincts organize themselves into a clear and urgent priority list. She needed intervention, she needed it tonight. He had perhaps 3 seconds to take all of this in before Varathos woke. She went from apparently unconscious to entirely vertical in a movement that was so fast it seemed to violate the relationship between mass and momentum, throwing herself upright on 3 legs. The wounded shoulder barely touched down before she shifted her weight off it, compensating with an automatic, practiced adjustment that told him this was a wound she had been managing for days, and putting her body directly between Siveth and Marcus with a sound that was not quite a roar. It was something below a roar, something that lived in the frequency range where sound stops being heard and starts being felt, in the chest, in the jaw, in the specific places in the nervous system that evolution set aside for the processing of serious warnings. It was a sound that made the survival-oriented parts of Marcus's brain sit up very straight and pay close attention. He stopped moving. He held his hands out to his sides, palms open, fingers spread, the oldest gesture, the one that predated language and worked across the boundaries between species because the underlying message was too fundamental to require translation. Nothing in my hands, nothing coming from me toward you. Varathos stared at him. Her eyes were amber like Siveth's. The resemblance was clear and immediate and would have been touching under other circumstances. But where Siveth's eyes had the enormous, slightly unfinished quality of youth, Varathos's were older and harder and burning with something that the fever had not diminished. She was looking at him with the complete, absolute focus of a predator assessing a threat while simultaneously running every calculation involved in protecting the thing behind her. And even sick, even swaying slightly on 3 legs, even with that terrible wound radiating heat and wrongness at her shoulder, she was the most formidably present thing Marcus had ever been in a confined space with. His heart was doing something loud and emphatic in his chest. He acknowledged this and set it aside. He stayed still. He held the eye contact, not in challenge, not with the direct aggressive stare that a threat would maintain, but with the steady, non-escalating attention of something that intended to remain in this space, and needed the occupant of the space to understand that removal was not going to resolve the situation. Siveth pressed against Varathos's uninjured flank and began to speak. The sound of Draconic at close range was extraordinary, nothing like Marcus had expected from his limited and distant previous exposures to it. It was layered in a way that human languages weren't, carrying multiple tonal registers simultaneously, resonance frequencies stacked on top of each other in combinations that seemed to carry information at a level below the individual syllables. Siveth's voice in Draconic was different from its voice in the common tongue, older sounding, more precise, carrying harmonics that its young human language speech hadn't contained. It spoke quickly, not frantically, with the careful pace of someone who understands that the listener's state requires clarity rather than speed. Marcus couldn't follow the content, but he could follow the shape of it, the repetition of certain sounds that he guessed were his name or his species or both, the cadence of explanation, the particular emphasis that landed on certain phrases and carried what he could only read as reassurance. Varathos listened. She listened without looking away from Marcus. Her eyes never moved from his face, reading him with an attention that made him feel simultaneously very seen and very small. Her breathing remained labored. The heat from the wound pressed against the ravine air in that dry, urgent way. Her 3-legged stance trembled slightly with the effort of maintaining it. The long minutes of Siveth's accounting passed. When the young dragon finished, there was silence in the ravine. A genuine silence the wind had stilled, or the rock walls were blocking it, or the moment simply demanded it. Marcus could hear his own heartbeat and Varathos's wet, careful breathing and the distant, indifferent sound of the melt stream somewhere below them. Then Varathos lowered herself back to the ground. It was not a surrender. Marcus was acutely conscious of that distinction and equally conscious that Varathos was conscious of it. She was making the distinction clearly through every physical choice in how the lowering happened. Not submission, not trust. The decision of a mind in full possession of the relevant facts and in complete control of its own calculus, choosing a course of action because the alternatives had been assessed and discarded. She came down like a geological feature returns to rest after an event, with the weight and deliberateness of something that had not been overcome but had chosen to be still. She dropped her great head to the ravine floor. Her eyes stayed on Marcus, and what was in them was the most complex communication he had ever received from a living thing without the intermediary of shared language. It was layered, the ferocity was still there, the maternal absolute of "if you harm my child this sickness will not stop me," but it was overlaid with something else now. Something that Marcus could only identify as the specific dignity of a proud creature, accepting necessary help from an uncertain source, holding both the acceptance and the pride simultaneously without letting either cancel the other. "Thank you," he said. He was not sure he was the right person to receive what she'd just given him, but he meant the thanks entirely. He moved to the wound. The work took the better part of an hour. He started with the examination, gloves on, approaching slowly and announcing each movement before he made it, not for Varathos' benefit alone but for his own, keeping himself in the methodical, step-by-step mental space that good medical work required. The wound was worse than the visual had suggested. The shrapnel fragment had gone deep, deep enough to be seated in the muscle rather than near the surface, cushioned by 3 days of inflammatory response that had tried to wall it off and succeeded only in creating a pressurized pocket of infection around it. The fragment itself was irregular, not a clean piece, not a bolt or a plate, but a jagged section of the drone's outer housing, roughly 4 centimeters at its longest dimension, with an edge that had caused additional tearing as the muscle had swollen around it. Marcus probed the wound with the long forceps and felt the fragment's position and understood why the wound hadn't been self-resolving. The irregularity of the edge was preventing the natural expulsion process, anchoring the piece in place. He was going to have to go in and get it. Throughout all of this, the examination, the irrigation, the careful probing, Varathos held still with a willpower that Marcus found genuinely humbling. When the forceps went deep and struck the fragment, and he felt the involuntary flinch move through her body like a wave through water, the sound she made was low and internal and immediately answered by Siveth, who had positioned itself at her mother's head and maintained a continuous, quiet, draconic stream throughout the entire procedure. The call and response of it, Varathos' pain sounds and Siveth's answering comfort frequency, was intimate in a way that made Marcus feel the weight of the trust he'd been given and work all the harder to deserve it. The fragment came free on the 3rd attempt. He felt it release, the specific sensation of something coming loose from where it had been held, and withdrew the forceps slowly and steadily, and looked at the piece of metal in the failing light, and felt a complicated feeling move through him that he classified as anger and set it aside for later. He irrigated thoroughly. He worked the antibiotic packing into the wound site with careful fingers, working around the scale architecture rather than against it. He bandaged as effectively as the surface geometry allowed, the copper scales creating edges and angles that standard bandaging wanted to pull against, requiring improvisation and additional layers, and a fastening system that he solved with the methodical creativity of someone who had done field medicine in conditions where the standard approach was not an option. He gave the antibiotic injection last, finding a site at the wound's edge where the scale coverage was thinner, where the transition tissue offered access, and delivering it with the steadiness of someone who was very aware that the creature receiving the injection could, technically, take his entire arm off and was choosing not to. When he finally sat back, his hands were trembling. Not badly, just the fine, persistent tremor that deep, focused work produced when the focus released and the body remembered what it had been doing. He was aware of multiple physical discomforts that had been cued and waiting: his knees, his lower back, a strain across his right shoulder from the angle he'd held through the wound irrigation. He was also aware of how dark it had gotten, the ravine now lit only by the thin remaining glow above the peaks and the ambient reflection of the snowfields higher up. He looked at Varathos. She was breathing differently. He noticed it immediately, not because the improvement was dramatic, it wasn't, the antibiotics would need hours to begin their real work, but because the quality of the breathing had changed. Less tight, less effortful. The specific way a body breathes when something that was pressing from inside has been removed. Her eyes were on him, still amber, still ancient, still burning with that complex fever and awareness flame, but the calculation behind them had changed. He could feel it, the way you feel a change in weather before you can name the specific meteorological event causing it. She spoke. Her voice was deep enough to feel in the chest cavity, resonant with the harmonics of draconic even in the common tongue, accented in a way that was not the accent of any human regional dialect, but something older and more fundamental, the accent of a language that had been spoken in these mountains before the mountains had a name. "You have my debt, soldier." "You don't owe me anything," Marcus said. His voice came out level, he meant it. "That is not how this works." The amber eyes held his with an implacability that was not argumentative, it wasn't inviting discussion, it was simply stating the nature of things. "I do not make declarations lightly, I do not make this one lightly, you will find in time that I do not say things I do not mean." Marcus looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the drone fragment in his pocket, irregular, jagged, stamped with a partial serial number from the base's automated patrol fleet. He thought about the briefing he'd attended a week ago and the data he'd brought and the inventory clipboard he'd carried through the hangar this afternoon. He thought about Siveth choosing him out of a whole compound of people based on a bird with an injured wing. He thought about the particular way that things connected, sometimes, whether you intended them to or not. "I do not make this one lightly," Varathos had said. "Neither do I," Marcus said quietly to the gathering dark of the ravine. Siveth's small body was pressed against Varathos's flank, the young dragon's heat and its mother's fever finding a shared equilibrium in the cold mountain air. Both pairs of amber eyes rested on Marcus, the ancient and the young, the worn and the unfinished, with a quality of attention that was not the attention of things being helped. It was the attention of things deciding something. He packed his instruments, cleaned his gloves, secured the bag. He would need to come back tomorrow with more antibiotics. He would need to manage the wound's progression over the next several days. He would need, at some point, to think very carefully about what he was doing and what it meant and where it was going. But those were tomorrow's problems, and tomorrow would have to manage itself. He looked up at the narrow strip of stars becoming visible above the ravine's edge, and at the dark peaks cutting their ancient profile against the sky, and at the small violet dragon pressed against its mother's copper flank in the deep shadow below the overhang. "I'll be back in the morning," he said, "before first light so I don't have to explain my route." Siveth pressed closer to Varathos and nodded once, the same solemn, formal nod as before, the gesture of a creature for whom a commitment accepted was a commitment held. Marcus shouldered his bag and climbed out of the ravine. Behind him, in the dark below the overhang, Varathos exhaled long and slow and careful, the breath of something that had survived today and was willing to consider the possibility of tomorrow. Siveth curled tighter against her mother's flank, listening to the human soldier's careful footsteps growing distant through the mountain dark. It listened until the footsteps were gone entirely. What debts become? The days that followed had a clandestine rhythm that Marcus had not anticipated and could not have planned for, but which assembled itself with the natural logic of things that are necessary and therefore find their form regardless of convenience. Before first light, every morning, he rose 40 minutes ahead of his scheduled wake time, a discipline that cost him sleep he could not entirely afford and which he paid without complaint, because the alternative was to make these trips in daylight, and daylight meant visibility, and visibility meant questions he was not yet prepared to answer. He moved through the base's pre-dawn quiet with the same purposeful, unremarkable stride he used for everything, the field bag over one shoulder, the route northeast rehearsed and adjusted each day against the previous day's patrol patterns. He had 11 years of experience moving through spaces in ways that did not attract attention. He used all of it. The wound's progression over the first 72 hours was the thing that occupied most of his waking mental space, the part that wasn't occupied by his regular duties, which he performed with the scrupulous completeness of a man who understood that professional unremarkability was currently a survival skill. The infection had been deep and established, and the antibiotics needed time to assert themselves against it. And Marcus spent those early visits doing the work of watching carefully and intervening precisely and resisting the urge to do more than was useful, which was its own kind of discipline. Varathos bore the daily wound management with the same extraordinary stillness she had shown on the first night. She did not make it warm, she did not make any of it warm in those early days, and Marcus did not expect her to. She permitted him, which was its own considerable statement given the history she carried and the instincts she was working against. She watched him with those amber eyes throughout every visit, reading him continuously, and he understood that the debt she had declared was not simply gratitude for the intervention but something that would be earned daily, in the accumulated evidence of consistency. He showed up. Every morning before the light, he treated the wound, assessed the progress, adjusted the antibiotic regimen as the infection responded. He brought food once, dried meat from his own rations, the calorie-dense kind issued for field operations, offered without ceremony and accepted without comment, consumed with the careful deliberateness of a large predator that was not yet sure how to categorize the gesture. He left without staying longer than the work required. He did not push. He did not perform. He simply came when he said he would come and did what he said he would do and left when the doing was finished. By the fourth day, Varathos's color had begun to return. By the sixth, the wound was closing properly, the tissue consolidating, the inflammation retreating from its angry peak toward the quieter business of healing. The scale discoloration around the wound site was fatting at the edges, the natural copper reasserting itself in the patches furthest from the original injury. Her breathing had shed its labored quality entirely. She was eating. Siveth had resumed fishing and hunting with considerably more energy and success now that the constant low-grade terror of the previous week had lifted, and the ravine in the mornings carried the sounds of a young dragon conducting itself with the enthusiastic imprecision of something learning what its capabilities actually were. Varathos, Marcus noticed on the seventh morning, was watching him differently. Not with less attention. If anything, the attention had sharpened, become more specific. But the quality had changed in the way that weather changes when the fundamental conditions shift, the same sky, different air. The ferocity was still present, always present, the bedrock of her maternal absolute that he suspected would be present until the last moment of her life and possibly beyond it. But it had been joined by something that sat alongside it rather than replacing it. And that thing was the particular quality of a mind that has been measuring something for a long time and has arrived at a conclusion it is willing to act on. She had begun to speak to him. Not the single weighted declarations of the early visits, those had been statements complete in themselves, not requiring response. This was different. Questions, at first careful, precise, specific questions about the base and its protocols and the nature of the drone systems and the chain of command that governed their deployment. Marcus answered honestly, which seemed to be the expected response and which Varathos received with a focused attention that reminded him of his best commanding officers. The ones who listened to information rather than just waiting for it to stop. Then observations. About the mountain. About the patterns she'd watched from above over years of flight across this range. About the clan movements in the northern passes that the base's intelligence unit was, in her estimation, misreading badly because they were interpreting draconic territorial behavior through a human lens that didn't account for the seasonal variance in the relevant social structures. Marcus listened to all of it. He took none of it for granted. He found himself, on the walk back to base each morning, turning what she'd said over in his mind with the same care he'd give to any high-quality intelligence from any source. Siveth, during all of this, watched them both. It was on the 11th day that Marcus arrived at the ravine and found Varathos standing. Not lying in the compensation posture she'd maintained through the recovery, standing fully, all four limbs bearing weight, the wounded shoulder carrying its share without the subtle offloading that had characterized her movement since the injury. She was facing the ravine's east wall, her head raised, her copper scales in the early light doing what Marcus now understood they were supposed to do, catching and holding, and transforming the light into something that was half camouflage and half declaration, the ambiguity of it entirely intentional. She heard him coming, she always heard him coming. He was fairly certain she could hear him from the base's perimeter and turned, and the movement was fluid and complete and unguarded by pain. Marcus stopped. He looked at her for a moment. Then he set his bag down on the ravine floor and said, "How does it feel?" "Like mine again," she said. The simplicity of it carried everything. He checked the wound site anyway, professional obligation and genuine investment overriding the redundancy, and found it healed to the degree that further daily intervention was unnecessary. The scale coverage was regrowing at the edges, new scales coming in slightly darker than the surrounding copper, which Varathos informed him was normal and would fade over several months. The muscle had consolidated cleanly. The range of motion was not yet fully restored, but the trajectory was clear and good. He repacked his bag for what he understood was the last clinical visit. The silence that followed had a different weight than the silences of the previous 10 days. Those had been working silences, spaces around the practical activity. This one was the silence of a transition point, the moment after a thing has been completed, but before the next thing has defined itself. "You are worried," Varathos said. She was watching him with that specific attention that she'd developed over 11 days of continuous close observation. "Not about you," he said honestly. "About what comes after." He looked at the wound site one more time, at his hands, at the bag. "I've been coming out here every morning for 11 days. I've been taking supplies from a cabinet that doesn't officially know they're missing yet. I've been modifying my patrol route paperwork to account for the time." He paused. "I'm a sergeant in a military installation with a commanding officer who already thinks I ask too many inconvenient questions. At some point, the arithmetic catches up." "And yet you came every mornings." "Oh, yes." Knowing the arithmetic. Oh, yes. Varathos was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had that quality it occasionally reached, the deep resonance that carried something older than the conversation, something that lived below the specific words in the frequency of geological time. There are humans, she said slowly, who do the right thing when it costs them nothing. There are far fewer who do it when it costs them something they can measure. And there are very few indeed who do it when they can see the cost clearly in advance and choose it anyway. A pause. I have been watching your kind for a long time, soldier. I know which category is rare. Marcus looked at her. He thought about 11 years of military service and the things it had taught him about the nature of institutions, and the people who served them and the gap that sometimes existed between those two things. He thought about a kestrel in a box. He thought about a small violet dragon with enormous amber eyes asking a question in a dusty hangar with the last of its available courage. I should go, he said. I've got a full duty day and I'm already running it close. Go then, Varathos said, and then as he turned to climb the ravine, Marcus. It was the first time she had used his given name. He stopped. We will not be fars. He nodded once he climbed. The ambush came 17 days later, on the 7th kilometer of a mountain pass that everyone in the convoy's security detail had assessed as manageable, and which turned out, in the specific way that mountain passes in active conflict zones have of revealing themselves, to be considerably less than that. The intelligence had been bad, not wrong exactly, but incomplete in the particular way that intelligence is incomplete when it is being generated by systems that do not fully understand the terrain they are reading. The rival clan coalition that had been tracked moving south through the Kestrel Gap had not continued south. They had split, half continuing on the tracked route as a decoy, half circling east and high, moving onto the ridgeline above the pass 3 days before the convoy route had been finalized. Patient, disciplined, and well-coordinated, Marcus would have been professionally impressed if he'd had any attention to spare for impressions. He didn't. He had 12 soldiers, 6 vehicles, a supply convoy that the northern bases needed to stay operational, and an ambush that had been designed by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The first explosion took out the lead vehicle before the echo of the second had finished. Marcus was out of his transport before the sound had fully assembled itself, moving with the full-body automatic engagement of someone for whom the gap between perception and action had been compressed by years of practice to something close to simultaneous. He called his team to positions, his voice carrying the specific quality that good field commanders develop, the frequency and cadence that cuts through noise and fear and reaches the trained part of a soldier's nervous system that is waiting for exactly that signal. They were good soldiers. They moved well, they held their positions, they communicated cleanly. Under other circumstances, against a smaller or less elevated attack force, it might have been enough. But the ridgeline positions had the angle, and the angle in mountain terrain is everything, and Marcus was in the middle of running the numbers. The specific cold arithmetic of how long they could hold against how many positions they needed to cover with how many people. And finding that the numbers came up short when the sky above the pass did something that was not in any version of the arithmetic he'd been running. It opened. That was the only word that fit. The sky opened, the way it opens for weather events and nothing else. A sudden comprehensive change in the quality of the air above them. A pressure change. A sound below sound that arrived before the visual and hit the chest and the jaw and the survival architecture of the nervous system simultaneously. And then Varathos came through it. She dropped from the ridge dark above like a geological event that had decided to become personal. 300 meters of vertical fall, arrested at the last possible moment into a banking turn that brought her across the ridgeline positions at a height that was technically flying and practically wasn't. Her wings throwing a pressure wave that Marcus felt as a physical impact even from his position on the road below. The sound she made, the declaration, the frequency that carried below the audible range into the range that living things simply respond to without the intermediary of conscious processing, rolled off the peaks and returned doubled and tripled until the pass itself seemed to be making the sound. She hit the highest ridgeline position like weather. Marcus watched it happen with the divided attention of someone who was simultaneously running a tactical operation and experiencing something that was going to take considerably longer than the current operational tempo allowed to fully process. He watched Varathos move across the high ground with a speed and precision that the fever and the wound and 17 days of recovery had apparently not diminished in any meaningful degree. If anything, there was something in the movement that suggested accumulated energy, the specific purposefulness of something that had been still for longer than its nature preferred, and was now applying the accumulated reserve of that stillness to the immediate problem with complete commitment. The ambush broke in stages, the way organized things break not all at once, but in the sequential collapse of the logic that holds the organization together. The first position fell to Varathos's initial pass. The second and third fell to the chaos of the first falling. When one element of a coordinated attack ceases to function, the elements adjacent to it lose the mutual support that coordination provides, and what was an organized force becomes a collection of individuals making individual decisions. And individual decisions under those conditions trend strongly toward survival rather than objective completion. Within 4 minutes, the ridgeline fire had reduced by 2/3. Within 8, it had effectively ended, the remaining elements withdrawing into the mountain dark with the particular speed of people who have encountered something that was not in their operational planning. The convoy security detail held the road, no further casualties after the initial engagement. 3 wounded, none critical. Marcus stood in the road after the last shots and looked up at the ridgeline and found Varathos there, landed, still, copper scales gone dark in the mountain night, her outline barely distinguishable from the rock. Beside her, smaller and faster and already looking down at Marcus with those amber eyes, Siveth. He climbed. The high ground above the pass was cold with the specific cold of elevation and recent violence, the particular temperature that settles over places after they have been used for something terrible, and the terrible thing is finished. Marcus's breath came short from the climb and the altitude and the specific physiological aftermath of sustained combat engagement, the body beginning to process what the mind had held at operational distance during the fighting. He reached them on a broad shelf of rock that jutted from the ridge with a natural confidence, as though the mountain had put it there for exactly this purpose. Siveth was at the edge of it, looking down at the road below with the sharp interest of a creature cataloging the aftermath. Varathos stood in the center of the shelf, her wounded shoulder moving freely in the cold air, watching Marcus complete the last of the climb with an expression that he had, over 17 days of daily observation, learned to read with some degree of accuracy. She had been waiting for him to arrive, he understood, not anxiously, with the patience of something that had known he would come because he was consistently the kind of person who came. He stopped a few feet away. His chest was heaving slightly from the climb. He made no effort to disguise this. Varathos had been watching him long enough that pretense in either direction would have been both transparent and rude. "You were watching the base," he said when he had enough breath to say it steadily. "Not just the ravine, the whole base. The base, the patrol routes, the convoy scheduling, the northern pass access roads." A pause. "Also you specifically rather more than the other elements." "How long?" "Since the third morning." Her tone carried no apology for this, it was delivered as simple fact, accurate information offered to someone who was owed accurate information. "You move differently from the other soldiers. You watch the terrain rather than the road. You adjust your position before problems arrive rather than after." A beat. "These are qualities I find professionally relevant." Something about the phrasing, the dry precision of professionally relevant, delivered in that resonant, mountain-accented voice, moved through Marcus with a warmth that he hadn't anticipated and didn't try to classify. He looked out at the pass below, at the disabled vehicles and the organized movement of his team beginning the recovery process, at the peaks beyond running their dark profiles against a sky that had gone fully to stars. "Siveth chose me," he said, not quite a question. The young dragon turned from the road's edge, hearing its name in the sentence. It regarded Marcus with those enormous amber eyes, and the expression in them was the same complicated, layered thing it always was, the ongoing calculation, the continuous measurement, but underneath it now was something that had settled. Something that had been running the numbers for 17 days and was content with the result. "I watched for a long time," Siveth said. Its voice had recovered fully. The hoarseness was long gone, replaced by something cleaner, a young voice still finding its register, carrying those same faint harmonic undertones in the common tongue that suggested the architecture of Draconic underneath it. "The base has many soldiers. Most of them look at the mountains and see obstacles or threats or nothing at all." A pause. "You looked at them like you were trying to understand something." Marcus thought about this. It was, he supposed, accurate. He had spent 11 years on the Varath frontier and had never quite managed to make the mountains simply backdrop. They kept demanding attention, kept offering the sense that they contained information he didn't have the language for yet. "The bird," he said. "The bird," Siveth confirmed, with the quality of something citing evidence for a conclusion already reached. "A kestrel. You found it by the perimeter wire with a broken wing. You did not move on. You found a container. You put it somewhere protected. You came back to it." The amber eyes held his steadily. "Most of the other soldiers walked past it 3 times that morning, I counted." "It was just," he started. "You were going to say just a bird," Siveth said, with a precision that suggested this was not a guess. "Mama told me the rest of that sentence before you finished it." "There is no such thing," Varathos said from behind him, "as just a living thing. This is not sentiment, it is accuracy. The world is made of living things in relation to each other. A person who understands this is a different kind of person from one who does not. She moved to stand beside him at the shelf's edge, her great copper bulk settling with a solidity that changed the temperature of the air immediately around him. Warmth, the deep particular warmth of a large living thing at rest. I have lived long enough to learn to identify the difference quickly. It is a useful skill. Marcus was quiet for a moment, looking out at the dark mountains. Below them, he could see the lights of the recovery operation beginning, his team moving with the practiced efficiency of soldiers who had held through something difficult and come out the other side and were now doing the unglamorous necessary work of the aftermath. Good soldiers. His soldiers. He thought about the report he would need to write. The after-action documentation that would need to account for the outcome of an ambush that had been broken not by available base support assets or allied air cover, but by something that the official reporting categories did not have a field for. He thought about Captain Renner reading that report. He thought about the inventory supplies that Danny Osa had, presumably by now, noticed were missing from her secondary cabinet, and had made her own quiet accounting about. He thought about all the ways that whatever it was in the process of becoming, was going to complicate his professional life in ways that were measurable and ongoing. He found, examining the thought honestly, that the measurement didn't particularly change anything. "I'm going to have a significant problem explaining you to my commanding officer," he said. Siveth made the sound he had identified on the 8th morning as laughter, a rapid, resonant series of short exhalations that carried those harmonic layers and didn't sound anything like human laughter, but communicated the same thing with complete clarity. Varathos's expression, in the corner of his vision, shifted in a way he had learned over 17 mornings, to read as amusement that she was not going to the trouble of concealing. "You have managed considerably more complicated explanations in considerably more difficult circumstances," she said. "I have watched you explain your route paperwork for 11 consecutive mornings. Your creativity in that area is, frankly, impressive." Marcus laughed, a genuine laugh, the kind that comes out before the internal editor gets to it, surprised and full and warm in the cold mountain air. It felt strange in his chest, the way real laughter does when it has been a while, when the preceding days have been the kind of days that don't produce it. He was aware of Siveth pressing against his side, the small violet body appearing at his left without announcement and leaning there with a casualness that was entirely deliberate, the casual contact of a creature that had made a decision about a person and was now simply enacting the decision's practical implications. He looked down. Siveth looked up. The enormous amber eyes carried the same complicated, layered quality they always had, but the calculation behind them had resolved into something that lived on the other side of calculation entirely. He put his hand on the young dragon's neck, carefully, the way he did everything around them, with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the gestures you make with people you are learning to trust carry more weight than ordinary gestures. Siveth leaned into it with a sigh that came from somewhere deep, the sound of accumulated tension finally finding permission to release. "We will be here," Varathos said. Her voice was quiet now, the mountain resonance present but not deployed, the declaration made in the register of something said between people rather than announced to space. "When we are needed, and when you are," a pause, "these will not always be different occasions." Marcus nodded. He understood the weight of what she was offering and the weight of what it would require and the weight of what it meant that she was offering it at all, this creature who had told her child not to trust humans, who carried the long memory of reasons for that instruction, who had nonetheless lowered herself to the ravine floor and allowed a human soldier with borrowed supplies and uncertain authority to work on her wound for an hour in the fatting dark, who had watched him for 17 mornings. Who had come across the mountains at night when the arithmetic required it. He understood that what Varathos was describing was not an alliance in any institutional sense. It was not a treaty or an arrangement or an agreement with clauses and conditions. It was something older than those things, the kind of bond that forms between specific people or specific people and specific extraordinary creatures, when consistency has been shown and tested and shown again, and the testing has reached its conclusion. It was the thing that happens when someone shows up every morning before the light, because they said they would. He stood on the shelf of rock above the Varath Pass with a copper dragon and her violet child, and the stars of a mountain sky that had watched things older than any of them come and go across these peaks. And he let the moment be what it was without trying to fit it into any of the categories his training or his experience had given him. Below, his team worked in the lights of the convoy. Above, the mountains ran their cold, dark profiles against the stars. Around him, the two creatures who had, apparently, decided that he was their particular business, for reasons that had begun with a kestrel in a box and had become something he did not yet have language for, but which he recognized in the way you recognize things that are important before you can explain why. He stayed a few minutes longer than he needed to. Then he turned from the edge. "I'll need to come back tomorrow," he said. "Not for the wound, just," he stopped, reconsidered the sentence. "The intelligence you shared about the clan movements in the northern passes, I want to understand it properly. I want to be able to do something useful with it." Varathos regarded him with those ancient amber eyes, and the thing in them was not surprise. He understood by now that he would have to work quite hard to genuinely surprise her, but something that sat in the vicinity of satisfaction, the look of a very long calculation arriving at a result that matched the projection. "Before first light," she said, "as usual." "As usual," Marcus agreed. He shouldered his bag. He looked at Siveth one more time, the small violet dragon watching him go with those eyes that had been watching him since before he'd known they were watching, that had looked at him in a dusty hangar with nothing left but honesty and chosen to bet everything on what they'd seen. He went down the ridge. Behind him, on the high shelf of rock above the pass, the copper dragon folded her great wings and looked out over the mountains that had been her home for longer than the base below had been a concept in anyone's mind. The violet dragon pressed against her flank and watched the human soldier's careful descent through the dark below them, tracking his movement until the road swallowed him, and he was indistinguishable from the other small lights moving in the aftermath of the night's events. Varathos spoke softly, draconic, the layered resonance of it absorbed by the cold rock around them private. Siveth answered, equally soft. What passed between them was not translatable, was not meant to be translatable, was the specific language of two creatures who knew each other completely and had learned, in the previous 17 days, to extend the edges of that knowing outward to include something new. The mountains were quiet, the stars were clear. Somewhere below, a sergeant with a field bag and 11 years of service, and an after-action report that was going to require significant creativity, moved through the dark toward a base that did not yet know what had happened tonight, or what had been decided on a ridge above a mountain pass, or what was going to be different from here forward. The mountains knew they had watched things begin here before. They kept the knowledge, as they always did in the cold and the rock and the long silence between one era and the next, and waited with the patience of very old things for the rest to unfold.